Chapter 3. Preach, but don't preach. Quote by Audre Lorde. I have come to believe over and over again that what is most important to me must be spoken, made verbal, and shared, even at the risk of having it bruised or misunderstood. End quote. Whether it's a presentation to your team at work, a speech to accept a community service award, a monologue for open mic night, or your next sermon, how you construct your message determines its impact. In the parlance of pastors, your congregation expects you to preach. So you want to exceed their expectations and preach with power, passion, and purpose like no one else. They want you to bring it, with it being everything you have it in you to communicate. They need you to be their voice, even as if you are the divine messenger for the transcendent voice of love. Preaching becomes a platform for acknowledging the depths of personal suffering of everyone in the room, as well as offering insight, information, encouragement, and inspiration for moving through pain and reclaiming personal power. It's important to note, however, that the word preach sometimes carries a pejorative connotation. In this usage, preaching is directive, prescriptive, often authoritarian, and frequently self righteous. People might say, "Don't preach at me," or "Keep your preaching in the pulpit." They're referencing times when they've experienced preaching as a monologue, not a dialogue, as a way of overwhelming others with certain beliefs that must be accepted. This kind of preaching rarely goes down well, though. None of us likes to be hammered by the harsh harangue of someone on their high horse. This kind of preaching is not limited to the pulpit, but found in the classroom, in the boardroom, and on the campaign trail. It assumes a barrier rather than a bridge between the speaker and the listeners. A boundary that needs reinforcing rather than being reevaluated. Growing up and experiencing a variety of different preachers and teachers, I quickly realized that the ones who tried to elevate themselves above their audiences created a barrier that only got in the way of the efficacy of their message. These were the teachers who delighted in humiliating students, ignorance in the classroom rather than igniting their curiosity for learning. These were the preachers spewing fire and brimstone from their pulpits who failed to see how scarred and scorched their congregants were from their life circumstances. The key to preaching like an artist and not an antagonist begins with your attitude. As we have touched on and will explore in chapters to come, identifying and connecting with your audience is essential. Even when you and those receiving your communication have nothing in common except your humanity and a common language. And sometimes, not even that. Which means you need a good translator. You build from there. You consider what you have to offer those receiving your message and then construct it for maximum impact. If you want to preach in the best sense and not the worst, then you must align your attitude with your architecture. Just as a blueprint helps a contractor bring the architect's vision to life, an outline or structural overview of your message provides you with visual navigating its contents. While you don't want to read from a script or forego an outline altogether and simply wing it, you will find that having a blueprint opens up the middle ground in between those extremes. Outlines keep you grounded, focused, and centered on the primary points of your communication. They give you a skeleton, a scaffold, and structure to support the ideas, examples, and anecdotes of your message. I use the term outline for lack of a better one, but I realize an outline often varies in associations. Some of us inwardly groan when we hear or see the word because it takes us back to English class or past public speaking opportunities, assignments, and situations where outlines were required and part of our assessment. We felt forced to contrive an artificial order with a prescribed number of points and supporting subpoints based on someone else's predetermined formula. While using someone else's formula for outlining your message can sometimes help you get started, rarely does it permit you the room you need. In other words, use other formulas for outlines as launching pads, not constricting containers. This enables you to discover a system of outlining that works best for you. The best borrowed outlines can give you the security of a place from which to build and the freedom to grow organically as your ideas take shape. If you're not compelled to use a prescribed outline format, then you have the luxury of crafting your own. Some people may find this easy enough and have a natural talent for what they want to say and how to best say it. These people are often logical, analytical thinkers who see how sequences of ideas fit together. Most of us, I suspect, find the early stages of forming our message a bit intimidating and overwhelming. Perhaps you have a vague idea of the kind of message you want to deliver for your particular audience at your event or occasion, but don't know how to start actual construction. This place is often where I find myself when I'm invited to preach, speak, or deliver an address of some kind. Sometimes I will quickly see how my ideas connect and can come up with a tentative outline. Most times, though, I need to do some excavation before my exclamation. I call this process digging for bones. While some topics or messages may lend themselves to outlining before researching, most messages benefit from collecting the parts and pieces that you can then order and arrange to put flesh and breathe life into those bones. Archaeologists dig and excavate for artifacts like pottery, coins, and jewelry, as well as bones of past civilizations. From the evidence uncovered, they begin to form a description, a hypothesis, and about this culture, its customs and systems. Putting together your message casts you in the same kind of role. Your research includes looking at the big picture as well as the small details related to your topic, theme, subject matter, and main points. You're playing detective as well as archaeologist, looking for clues that reveal the heart of what it is you want to say. You want to know who the main experts are in your field of study and look at facts, figures, and data, depending on their relevance. Memorable quotations, surprising stats, and historical analysis often provide the hues and shades necessary to color your vivid style of delivery. Make notes for yourself, flagging sources or statements you want to reflect upon or return to later. Collect bones. Collect more bones than you need so you can see which ones fit together in the best, most organic way. When our children were small, I recall many Christmas Eves spent with screwdrivers and wrenches in hand as my wife and I assembled tricycles, wagons, and bicycles. We would tighten the last screw or adjust the final bolt, and then Sarita would point to a handful of nuts, bolts, washers, and assorted hardware and say, "Well, what about these?" I'd look at her with wide, sleep deprived eyes and silently communicate, "Are you kidding me?" "But we followed the directions!" Then we would both laugh and give our newly constructed vehicle another safety check. Following the instructions we had assembled, it soundly, but still had pieces left over. My point being, those trikes and bikes worked just fine without them. So will your message. Once you feel you have plenty of bones, then it's time to assemble them into a skeleton for your message. A spinal column that will support the body of the message you're birthing. At this stage, you often sort topics and points that relate to one another, grouping them together based on similarities or on their distinct relationships. You decide what makes a cut and what doesn't, what illuminates and supports versus what detracts, distracts, or diverts your audience's attention. You consider the amount of time you have and eliminate points that ultimately don't justify their inclusion within the bounds of your limitation. As the bones fall into place, don't be surprised if you discover you have enough for two messages. The best sermon I've never preached. It's important at this stage to be very objective and honest with yourself. Several of my writer friends have told me the importance of the adage to kill your little darlings, a turn of phrase attributed to a variety of authors, including Oscar Wilde, T.S. Eliot, and William Faulkner. Regardless of its origin, the harsh wisdom of this editorial edict withstands the test of time. No one is advocating murder or violence of any kind, but simply the courage to curate your communication. And it's more difficult than it sounds because your little darlings are often your favorite parts of a message, the personal story that means so much to you, the startling research studies, findings, or the historical and cultural context of the passage chosen for study. But they're ultimately unnecessary and run the risk of being indulgent, tangential, distracting, or irrelevant. No matter how beautifully phrased or emotionally moving they may be, they have to fit into the body of the message you're birthing. Bodies don't need more than one heart. You might even be surprised and create an entire message only to discover that it does not serve the needs of your constituents. Perhaps the best sermon I've never preached was inspired by one of my trips to Africa. If you know me at all, then you know I have a deep, abiding love for the people, culture, and landscapes of this fascinating continent. It's a transcendent spiritual connection and affinity that ultimately defies my ability to define its many facets. So, after returning from a visit of several African nations, I became drawn to the variety of languages and tribal dialects. Many linguists and historians believe more than 2,000 languages were spoken on the continent prior to the colonialism. once Europeans arrived to conquer and exploit resources. New languages and cultural expressions infuse the many dialects already in use across the enormous and diverse native peoples. These layers of white supremacy, empirical rule, and tribal oppression, including slavery and servitude, only exasperated the challenge of intertribal communication. Even today, many African cultures continue to untangle the knotted skein of linguistic threads woven into their history. Many nations are relatively new in gaining independence from colonization and struggle to understand the essence of their identity, including tribal and cultural languages. Who am I? And where do I belong? Remain essential questions for many individuals as well as entire tribes, cultures, and nations. With all of this information in mind, I naturally thought of Nimrod in the Bible, Genesis 10. Noah's great grandson, Nimrod, is thought by some scholars to have feared that another flood might wipe out the earth. So he decided to build a tower high enough to withstand the flood. His plan coincides with what we're told about the Tower of Babel, which resulted from the whole world having one language and common speech. Harnessing this capacity for such comprehensive communication, the people decided to build a tower reaching to the heavens to demonstrate their abilities. The Lord, however, knew the incredible pride that would result from such a feat and confused the language of the whole world, presumably to keep people humble. So I began to compile parallels between challenges of communication in African cultures and the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. I saw all kinds of similarities in the dynamics between the conformity of colonialism and the hubris of people in Nimrod's time, along with the resulting catastrophe of communication after both fell apart. I conducted all this historical research about the Tower of Babel and how different experts interpret and apply it, with an excuse to dive deeper into the languages and cultures of African peoples. I compared forms of communication among tribes and famous examples of miscommunication. Then, just as it all came together in my mind as this brilliant, perfect sermon, I asked myself a question that leveled my own tower. What difference does this make? There I was, birthing a message that had come together so naturally and easily, born of my passion, my curiosity, and my fascination as two of my greatest loves, Africa and the Bible. Intersected and briefly united with all this information and insight for a sermon, I stepped back and looked at all the bones. And I couldn't figure out my point. How would my message, for all its self-congratulatory brilliance, inspire and encourage the single mother with 3 kids in my congregation? How would it speak to the prominent leader in the church struggling with how to love his children in the midst of their addictions? What practical value would my message have for the family, scraping by month from month to month, who couldn't pay next month's rent, let alone the medical costs of their baby's surgery? Because I could not answer these questions, I never preached that sermon. as much as I loved it. I realized it didn't fit my brand because it didn't deliver the promise I'm dedicated to delivering. As the body of your message takes shape, you identify its heartbeat. I think of a sermon like a company thinks about its brand because I want to deliver on the promise established my message and methods of presentation. My sermons must have spiritual relevancy, inspirational encouragement, and action worthy application. This one, for all it's worth, did not meet these criteria. No matter how much you like it, make sure those receiving your message will find it valuable, practical, and personally relevant. I could talk about what theologians think of Nimrod all day, but how did that transfer to take away benefits for those I was there to minister and to serve? I could tell stories of many indelible, vivid moments from my latest visit to Africa, but other than perhaps entertaining my listeners, what would they take away to help them in their lives, to help their faith grow? You will have your own brand to fulfill, but as you assemble any message, it's good to keep in mind two foundational pillars: who cares and so what? A friend of mine is an English professor who often teaches writing classes to students, to college students. And these are the two succinct guiding questions he instills in all his developing writers: identifying your audience and keeping them in mind. Who cares is paramount for impact, he told me. But there must also be something worth saying, the heart of your message that makes some kind of difference so that the very audience, so what? If your message doesn't make a difference that make your listeners' lives better, then don't bother. Put the bones aside and start again. Bones and bends. After you have assembled your bones into the body of your message, then you must bring it to life. One of the best ways to make your communication dynamic is to follow the energy of your topic, passage, or story. When you read a text from an exegetical perspective, the passage or story has bends in it. Often, as conflicts form, get addressed, and then resolved, these bends may be as subtle as a wink based on a curious word choice, or as explosive as a landmine erupting from the context. Take, for example, the parable Jesus told about the prodigal son. Luke chapter 15, verse 11 through 32. The drama begins with a certain son, the younger of two. As it turns out, asks for his inheritance before his father dies. He wants to see the world and enjoy himself without having to weigh on events beyond his control. So he takes matters into his own hands, and his father grants him his inheritance, which sets up the first major bend as the son gets what he asks for. He enjoys his newfound freedom and the lavish lifestyle he can afford for a brief while. Then the next major bend in the story occurs when a famine strikes the land. We can all relate to the tumultuous, painful, unexpected consequences this young man experiences when the unimaginable envelops his land. None of us imagines the size, the shape, or the ongoing impact of the COVID-19 pandemic would have on our lives, but it has indeed bent everyone's story in unexpected directions. So the prodigal son does what he has to do in order to survive: work as a field hand for a farmer. Then, as the young man is slopping the hogs, as we used to call it in West Virginia, where I grew up, he has an epiphany. Another bend in the story. He realizes that there he is, so hungry that he envies the pigs, their scraps of pods, husks, and rinds that he's feeding them. When he recalls that even the lowliest of hired hands were well fed back at his father's house. The prodigal returns home to discover that his father not only welcomes him, but throws a party like no other to celebrate his return, which might seem like the final bend in this story. Only there's one last revelation. The elder son resents the father's loving forgiveness toward his brother and begrudges him. The spectacular party to which his father replies, "My son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." All the strands come together to reinforce what it means to be lost and found. Finding the bends and beats in your message isn't limited to Bible passages. Whatever you're talking about, whatever examples and illustrations and anecdotes you choose to include, with all have twists and turns that you must maneuver and maximize for your methods. Sometimes the canvas for your material is a larger than life mural, while other times it's an exquisite scene distilled to its essence. And you may use one to inform the other. If you want to provide historical context with dates and documents, don't forget to think about the impact on actual human lives during these iconic moments. If you're showing a tight close up of an individual's transformational event, you will also want to be broad strokes in the background. It's one thing to talk about civil rights during the 1960s, and another to describe the swollen, aching feet of Rosa Parks boarding a bus and making an impactful, historical decision. You can talk about at-risk youth mentoring or transitional programs for those released from incarceration and include shocking data to make your point. But there is simply no substitute for the angry tears rolling down a child's face as she comes to terms with the devastating pain in her heart after losing a parent in the crossfire of gang wars in her neighborhood. No statistic can compare with contemptuous glances and slammed doors in the face of a man who has served his time and now seeks employment. Pain always has a face. And your job as a communicator is to place your listeners front and center to hear the stifled cries, taste the tears, smell the human sweat of those whose story you are privileged to share. Joy also has a face. The Bible tells us weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning. Psalm chapter 30, verse 5. For the joy, peace, comfort, and hope you wish to offer your audience to have power, you must frame it with the sorrows from which it was born. The messages infused with supernatural power to inspire, uplift, and encourage never shirk from the harsh, ragged edges of human pain. In order to appreciate the discovery of Jesus' resurrection on the third day, you must show the bitter tears of his grieving mother at the foot of the cross on the day of his death. You must not flinch from the searing pain of nails piercing his hands and feet the throbbing pain from the sword that had pierced his side, the blood dripping down his forehead into his eyes from the crown of thorns. Only when you know that Christ suffered the ultimate injustice and made the ultimate sacrifice can his resurrection and gift of salvation have power to speak to our experience. Obviously, I'm getting close to preaching here myself, but I hope you recognize my point. Whether you're discussing the last quarter's budget report, delivering a speech for your women's group, or preaching at your church this week, you still want to identify and follow the bends in your message in order to take your audience with you to a destination where you have gifted them with something they did not have, know, understand, or care about prior to your address. Know the needs. One of the keys to making sure you deliver on your promise as you put together your message is knowing the needs of your audience prior to delivery. After I was established as a pastor and had gained some experience in the pulpit, I began to be invited to speak at non-church related events. While I knew that the city leaders did not intend for me to preach a sermon, I had to make sure I knew what they did expect from me. When human resources executives reached out with an invitation to address an auditorium filled with employees, I wanted to make sure I spoke to the issues that had prompted their invitation. I quickly learned the importance of a pre-event conversation to discern and refine the purpose of my message for their constituents. Do they want me to motivate high school students to continue their education by attending college? Was I invited to help small business owners weather the challenges of new growth and potential expansions? Were city planners wanting my insight on how to anticipate growth patterns for urban development in that metro area? Answering these questions before I put the bones into the body of my address became paramount to bringing it to life. Meeting before your moment at the mic gives you clarity about your message. Recently, I was asked to speak at a meeting of the National Association of Minority Auto Dealers. They asked me to address entrepreneurial strategy for marketing to consumers as broadly as possible. Other than my ability to drive and appreciate cars, I have no experience with the product or selling vehicles in any economic climate, let alone changing times in which we live. They obviously knew this was outside my expertise and instead wanted me to talk about how I remain true to my brand for a diverse, multi-ethnic audience. Once I realized what they expected based on my brand identity, I enjoyed preparing my message for them, like a pharmacist preparing the prescription provided by a doctor for the patients they both serve. I gleaned the wisdom from Nomad's leaders to provide medicinal insight for all their participating members. Sometimes a group, company, institution, or event has a predetermined theme or message when they invite me to participate, usually as one of several keynote communicators. They trust that I will take into account the larger, overarching focus and build my message to dovetail with it accordingly. For example, when I recently agreed to speak at the Global Leadership Summit, I spent 3 hours on the phone with their team to help shape my message for the thematic issues promised by their brand that year's summit. I had to understand their motivation, the need being addressed by this large brand promise, and then see what I had to offer and how best to share it. The focus for that summit was on helping leaders address and practice inclusivity and diversity in their own communication styles. Both the GLS team and I agreed I wanted to do more than deliver the kind of message many of these participants would expect from me. Those in attendance usually have large platforms of their own as well as experience with effective communication. They needed something fresh, honest, and practical in facing the challenges presented by our current cultural climate of political division and systemic racism. These leaders needed more than just a summary of what they were already doing. Again, I focus on the so what factor for this audience to make sure they would care and find my communication valuable while also fulfilling the larger brand promise made by the GLS. Knowing the kind of frontline battles many of these leaders were facing, I chose something I suspected every one of them had faced and would continue to face: how to handle haters. I'm no more immune to critics than anyone, and in fact, have attracted more as my platform and visibility have increased. So, for the leaders at the GLS, I shared about a young man from Chicago who consistently bullied me on social media. No matter what I posted, tweeted, or shared online, this outspoken critic condemned me and my message. He showed no compassion or attempt at kindness or constructive criticism in his profanity laced diatribes against me. With the leaders at the summit, I shared as vulnerably as I could about how angry this online outlaw made me feel. How he deliberately baited me and tried to hurt me with mean spirited barbs and street thug epithets. I told them my honest reaction to this critic. How dare you? Who do you think you are to express so much personal vitriol when you don't even know me? Then I revealed how something inside me shifted when I let go of my anger and tried to practice what I preach, namely compassion, acceptance, and understanding. I realized that just because this young man and I were both black and had experienced poverty during our childhood, I assumed he should see us as having more in common. But then I got to thinking about all of his life experiences that were different than mine and alien to me. The crime, the gang violence in urban hoods, the drugs, the police brutality, and the general lack of justice and protection. I had to admit to myself that until I looked at the world through his lenses, I would never see how to bridge the gulf between us. With kinder vision and more understanding glasses, I considered how his profanity was simply street language to him, not even necessarily profane from his perspective. I saw that in his own way, he was attempting to have a conversation with me. He was sending out a cry for help. And yet, all I could do was focus on how he didn't know me or understand me. When in fact, I was doing the same to him. I was too busy being angry to see a young man with no father crying out to connect. After this example and how it initiated an ongoing conversation with someone I once viewed as an online assailant, I shared observation of the same dynamic when counseling couples. My role has always been to help each individual see their spouse's point of view and use different language in order that true dialogic communication could take place. When there is conflict, it's so tempting to resort to the safety of our default scripts. But true understanding only occurs when we risk listening to one another between the lines. Pivot to the power. My homework for leaders at the GLS challenged them to experience an environment with people different from themselves, one with a diversity level that forced them out of their comfort zone. Their goal was simply to observe, listen, and learn to see and hear in new ways. I encourage you to engage in the same exercise regarding new audiences and constituencies you wish to reach. Think about what those individuals will see and hear when they look at you and hear the message you're delivering. Remember, preaching is not about preaching at someone, but conversing, expressing, sharing, and listening to those you wish to reach. Spend time preparing, digging up bones, assembling the body, and use the spark between you and your audience to infuse life into your message. Preparation gives you the freedom to be spontaneous. The more you know your material and all the bends in the narrative, the more attuned you can be to your audience. Many times I developed an outline or skeleton of a message that I changed in the dynamic moment of the delivery. I may have prepared three main points from a message, but in the pulpit, since my audience's reactions to point number two necessitated spending the rest of our time together exploring that second point and why it hit a nerve. If I rushed on to make sure I finished where I planned to finish, I would have lost the opportunity to meet the greatest needs of my listeners. It's good to cover all the material you researched, explored, and prepared, but if you're present in the moment and sense the need to pivot to where there's more power, then do so. Remember, for all your advanced research and preparation, the communication between you and your audience is still a live event. Actors and performers on the stage know that sometimes the greatest moments come from improvising and making spontaneous changes. Technology may not cooperate, and your PowerPoint presentation may freeze on the screen behind you, but such glitches cannot change the impact of your message unless you allow them to do so. In fact, when PowerPoint and nascent technology were first introduced into meetings, sermons, and performances, the message was often eclipsed by the novelty of the new electronic media. Now, balance has been restored, so most speakers use tech tricks or PowerPoint slides to enhance their message, not to convey their most important points. The data, images, and pictures projected are more symbolic than instructive. You are the messenger for the message you're delivering, not your computer. Your phone, tablet, or laptop is your tool, not your crutch, understudy, or surrogate. Your audience wants to hear what you have to say, relevant to the occasion, context, and circumstances that have brought you together. Master your message so that you never drop the mic, at least not unless it's deliberately at the end of your preach, but don't preach.